Hello everyone, welcome to the Q&A for the TempleOS episode, a couple of months late, but it's here. I have a batch of questions from my $2 patrons and I'm ready to just rip through these. We have 37 of them, and so for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be omitting some of what they say. People said really nice and supportive things, but I'm just going to cut right to the question, but the whole comment is going to be on the screen so you can see what they said. And to everyone who was so supportive, thank you so much. Let's get started. First off, Olivier Morneau asks, are there specific details that have been substantiated concerning Terry's death other than what appears in the video? The details in the video were corroborated by local news stations that were pulling information from the local police. The information is pretty much as reliable as you believe those institutions to be. As a little extra bonus though, in the comments of the video there were multiple people that were saying that they were in the Dalles when that was happening, like they corroborated the fact that Terry A. Davis was in that area at the time. Calimel29 asks, when did you first become aware of TempleOS and its creator? I believe I learned about the topic from it being suggested by viewers. A lot of people submit their own ideas for episodes, and I do see at least a good portion of them, and TempleOS was one of those videos, was one of those topics that plenty of people had suggested, and I think that was where. Peter Melling asks, which of your previous subjects reminds you the most of Terry and his work? I'm sure this doesn't surprise anyone, but Time Cube reminds me a lot of it. Jean Ray and Terry both speak in very similar ways, even though they are vastly different people with vastly different experiences. Jean Ray very well may have been an excellent, electrical engineer. Whereas Terry, he definitely was an excellent programmer. I think that's not even up for question. Yeah, it took him forever to make TempleOS, but he actually made it from the ground up, and that's really impressive. So I'd say that superficially they're very similar, but I would say that they do feel the most alike in that they both became very obsessed with this small idea that they had created, that they believed much larger. Cozy Posy asks, did Physics Girl know about Terry, or was she completely unaware of his existence and all the claims that they were married? I do not have any concrete evidence to speak to whether Physics Girl knew about Terry A. Davis or not. It's possible that she just never notices emails. What I think happened is that Terry started spamming her with emails because he would email her multiple times a day. So I imagine what happened is she blocked him and he just kept sending emails not knowing that he was blocked, and then people from 4chan started to harass him and pretend to be Physics Girl. But other than that supposition, I couldn't tell you for certain. Meowmix64 asks, what do you do to help recover from very grim topics like this? Are there any steps you take to self-care after a deep dive like this? Historically, no. And that actually was part of the reason that this next episode is taking a little bit longer. January is a notoriously bad month for YouTube in terms of views and just ad revenue. Since it's the post-Christmas season, everyone's going back to school, or, they're going back to work, and people aren't buying as much because they just bought a bunch of gifts for Christmas. So I decided to take January off because I had a really bad work cycle. The problem isn't so much that the topics are heavy, but more that I'm a workaholic. So right now, what I'm trying to focus on is taking weekends. But to answer your question more precisely, no, I don't have any steps that I take for self-care when maybe I ought to. Sean Kelleher asks, could you find any independent evidence about the veracity of what he said in that post about all the sexual stuff from his past? No. Right now, if his family really was a part of that, then none of them have come forward, or maybe they don't even know that Terry talked about that kind of thing. All we have to go off of is Terry's claim. Devin Schubely asks, in your opinion, what is the most morally detestable thing Terry Davis committed? I think that that's an insanely complicated question, and I think it depends a lot on circumstance and information about those circumstances that I just don't know. So I don't feel qualified to give a really meaningful answer to that. I'm sorry. David Campari asks, what do you think is the best way to reconcile people like him who behaved in a very problematic way but wasn't completely responsible for his own behavior and what they have managed to achieve in their lives? I think that in the end, being sympathetic to people like that while also being conscious of what real-world consequences they have is the best way to go about it. So, for example, if someone is like shouting on a street corner, maybe you have those people preaching hellfire on the street corner, for example, you can pity that person because maybe they have some mental health issues, or they're going through a really rough period in their life, maybe there's a divorce. You can be sympathetic to that, but that doesn't mean that you have to engage with that person and put yourself in a compromising position. In the same way with Terry, you can come forward with an air of sympathy and understanding and trying to understand him, and maybe not be so judgmental, but also you don't have to engage with him. Engaging in that sort of sympathy might be uncomfortable at first, but it can help to understand these sorts of people better and approach a more constructive way of engaging with these people, because the more that you understand about what these people are going through or what they might be going through and recognizing the signs of these sorts of issues, the more you can approach with sympathy, and the better you might be able to handle these sorts of people in real life, and on both a personal and a societal level. Alright, I hope I'm getting this name right. Jesu GTZ asks, given that Terry is a controversial figure and given his racist rants and posts, did you fear at any time that the video would get a lot of backlash? Yes. I'm always worried that I'm going to get backlash, and I almost always get backlash from some small group at the very least. I try to minimize the risk as best I can, but it's always there. It's a work hazard. Josh Nielsen asks a similar question from before, but how/when did you find out about Terry/TempleOS? From the initial drama around the OS, or from his later mental breakdown/streaming? I talked a little bit about how I learned about it, I believe, from people suggesting the topic. And around that time, I think that he was living out of his van. In fact, no, I remember. So what happened was I was looking over some of the videos of what he was doing, and he was recording himself in Portland, Oregon, and I saw behind him that I was pretty sure I had seen the road that he was on, because it's on a very common route for the local public transit. And I started looking at his other videos, and I realized, this guy is in Portland. I live in the Pacific Northwest. So that's what really sort of like freaked me out, and that might have actually been what got me more interested at the time. But I also recognized that I had a lot other stuff I wanted to do, and also he was sort of in the middle of his own story. I didn't want to cover it just yet, so I set it to the side. So that's about when I discovered him. Madeline Swan asks, do you feel that the audience ever misunderstands your intention with videos? Given the touchy subjects of mental health and his racist rants, do you ever get comments that make you worry people have taken the intention of your video, which is purely to understand its subject, the wrong way? Or maybe there isn't a wrong way. I think that you hit it right at the end there. There really isn't a wrong way to engage with my videos. There are certainly certain things that I want my viewership to take away, but it's not my place as the creator to demand that my audience take away certain things from the videos or engage with it in a certain way. Hell, I don't even have control over how they view it. I remember seeing a comment that someone said that every time one of my videos comes out, they put it on their phone, turn their phone upside down, and start listening to it. which obviously, they're important visual components sometimes, but they're just people that do that kind of thing, and I have to keep that in mind. So if I don't even have control over how people consume my work, there's no way I can expect them to take away certain particular things from it. Puma asks, what was the deal with the drum set? It was mentioned as being a potential instigator for his conflict with his father, who bought it for him. What was the deal? Yeah, I skipped over that a little bit, and I think that might be one of the errors in that video. I remember specifically wanting to cover the drum kit a little bit more, and just not being able to. Terry was a drummer back in the day. He used to have a drum kit when he was little. I think I included an image of him as a kid. He had shared a picture online of him playing a drum kit when he was a kid. And he had started drumming along with his fingers on his desk to popular songs like rock tunes and metal tunes especially. And so what I can only imagine are trolls trying to make things worse between himself and his parents. They bought him a cheap drum kit for a couple €100 or something and mailed it to him. And I believe it was reported as delivered, and then Terry was kicked out only a few days later. I can't say that that was the reason that their fighting escalated, but it's definitely possible. I mean, we already saw, I kind of showed in the video that it was escalating significantly, but it's likely that Terry started playing those drums a lot. I mentioned in the video that he had a profound sense of ennui, that he just was so utterly bored, and that drum kit was probably stimulation for him that he wasn't getting otherwise. So that's, as far as I understand it, that's what happened. The problem is we just don't have enough information surrounding that to be sure. Taylor Liverman asks, have there been any attempts to revive TempleOS? Absolutely. There are forums, I think there's a subreddit, you can go anywhere and there will be builds for TempleOS. Some people are building off of it, other people probably half jokingly call it heretical to start changing it because, God's third temple is finished. But you can find it if you look online. Twiddle Chungus asks, what is your personal opinion of Terry's parents and their tough love attempt with their son? They weren't that tough on him. The only time they actually started getting tough was when he started getting aggressive with them. What I think more so happened was they were confused. They didn't know what to do. They had... Calling him an adult man-child, I think, is dismissive, but he was very childlike, in that he could not take care of himself at all. And he was getting social security checks, but he probably needed more support than he was getting. And obviously, he went off his medication eventually, and that's where things started to dip. I don't think that his parents are really to blame at all. I'm not sure that they knew what they could do, or even if there was anything they could do. They certainly tried. Jojo's Dogtail asks, by the end of his life, it was mentioned that he no longer had his van, right? So what I'm wondering is how he got to the Dalles from Portland. He walked. Actually, he was a known entity to the Portland police, and when they noticed that he was walking from Portland to the Dalles, they let the Dalles police know where he was going. The other part of the question is, do you believe his death was intentional? I don't know. I think... I would not be surprised if it was suicide. The last video that he did, I actually included it in the credits. At the very end of the credits, the last video with him has him very lucid, and he's calling himself a king, but he also is saying that he might just be this weird little man walking back and forth. And I suspect that maybe in a moment of clarity, he may have committed suicide, but I just don't have enough information. I don't think anyone does. Joseph Koch asks, what was that interesting spark that led you to look into TempleOS? What really interested me, I mentioned before that, he was in Portland, somewhere I'm familiar with. He also, had done something very similar to TimeCube. He had, this interesting online project. He had an online presence. So all those things are already, big flags for down the rabbit hole. But I think the most interesting bit to me, and the part that clinched it, was how he had made his own operating system and how monumental of a task that was, and how difficult it was. So the general online interest in him was what got me interested. What clinched it was the task that he managed to complete, and how he was almost the opposite of Jean Ray, in that he was acutely intelligent and skilled, where Jean Ray simply was not. And so I thought he would be a very interesting sort of parallel study to Jean Ray. Thomas Ryan asks, how does Terry compare to other similar down-the-rabbit-hole figures like Darger to you? Do you feel more or less sympathy for him, and do you feel he might be more troubled or less troubled than others you've covered? I don't think that there's really a way to put him on a scale. Each of the troubled people that I cover in the series are troubled in their own unique ways, and to equate them with one another and try to create a sliding scale for them, I think, is disingenuous and doesn't really do any of them justice. I think that schizophrenia is an extremely difficult thing to overcome, especially his severe schizophrenia, and he might not have been, I don't think he was wholly aware of his situation, and he was making it worse for himself, his schizophrenia at least, whether you want to blame him or his schizophrenia. I always think that there's some level in between. I hope that answered your question adequately. Talons of Ice and Fire asks if I would have ever interviewed Terry if given the chance, if only for the sake of posterity. Maybe. The main reason I avoid interviews and down the rabbit hole is so I can maintain a more distant position. There are certainly some topics where I very much want to go out and interview people. I might have mentioned it before, but I really want to do some further digging on the furry community sometime in the future, and at that point, I'd love to fly out to places and do interviews with people, especially like fursuit creators. There's a whole other world of fursuit creators with their own drama behind it that would be really interesting to cover. But for Terry A. Davis, I think even if I had the chance, which I kind of did in its own way, I still think that it was right for me not to. Nagano says, I have a feeling that the GoFundMe for the drum set was what caused that fight between Terry and his dad that led to him being kicked out of the family house. Had that GoFundMe not happened, do you think he would have still stayed at the house and not deteriorated further compared to what actually happened? By the time he got the drum kit, he was off his medication for a significant period, apparently because his dad forgot to pick it up and he just never went back onto it. I think that something was going to happen inevitably. The drum kit might have sped it along, but I don't think it was a necessary part of the violence. Roy asks, Terry's claim that he killed a CIA agent is very likely untrue, but it's very alarming nonetheless. Did you pursue evidence or any potential factual basis of it, or were you too skeptical of it to lend it much credence to begin with? I wouldn't be surprised if he did perform a hit and run a long time ago during one of his episodes. The problem is that it's likely that other people have looked into it a lot deeper than I have the time to, and they haven't come up with anything. I have seen nothing to suggest it, and the incident was so long ago that I am unlikely to find anything unless I spend, like, weeks or months looking for it. And given that it was unlikely that I would find anything, I didn't see it as worth my time. The Gibbous Gang asks, how was Terry able to do well education-wise with such an illness? Surely it would have affected him somehow in his school life. This is one of the things that's really weird. Schizophrenia tends to come on around the time that someone is in college or in high school. And his seems to have been a much later onset, and if he was exhibiting symptoms, they might not have been debilitating at that early period. However, we just don't have enough information about his life. Most of what we know about him before he started posting to the internet is only from him. He's the only source we have about himself. So it's possible that he wasn't exhibiting symptoms. It's possible that he did struggle more than he shared. William Treon asks, have you given any thought to interviewing Diana Cowan or Terry's parents? More generally, have you thought about interviewing the people close to the subjects of other Down the Rabbit Hole episodes? I see the purpose of Down the Rabbit Hole being a little bit more distant than this, except in some cases where it may be a little bit more difficult to dig up information without going out and interviewing or getting people to talk. For example, for the Game Life episode, I actually was able to interview Jeff Mendocino, and so that was something that was practically necessary because so much about Game Life has been lost to time and rotted away on the internet. But in the case of interviewing other people about Terry Davis, I'm ready to move on. After I made an episode, I feel like, for the most part, usually, I just want to move on to another topic and explore something else, and leave the extra interviews to other people who might be interested in the topic and want to explore it further. Kaleb Walken asks a very sympathetic question. My question is, how are you holding up after all this, Freddy? I'm doing much better now, but the episode was very rough, I won't lie. There was a 2-week period where I did nothing but skim through his live streams and his videos to see what I could find. A lot of the really great nuggets that I found and put in the video were very obscure things that like people weren't talking about at all, but I found because I spent those 2 weeks skimming through. I knew it would be worth it. It was taxing, but I'm doing a lot better now. If this next question is really from Justinroiland, that would be wild. But Justinroiland asks, it seems that his parents were upset with his hatred towards minorities and couldn't quite understand where it came from. Is there any idea where that came from and when exactly it started to manifest itself? This is another thing that's hard to pin down, because his racism didn't manifest itself online until a little while after people started ridiculing TempleOS or sort of writing him off or getting frustrated with him for being so confrontational on the message boards. It's very possible that that racism was there sort of under the surface and only came up when he started getting angry and frustrated, but even when he was getting really angry in those early stages, he didn't seem to be resorting to it. My suspicion, based on all the research that I did, is that he started to develop those racist tendencies sometime after he came online. And I have no idea where it could have come from, because it just started appearing. He expressed fear and frustration with, I believe his dentist was Indian, Middle Eastern, I think Indian, but he didn't say that his dentist had done anything in particular. But it seems that there was some incident around that time that sparked the racism, and it seems that after he developed those racist tendencies, he started looking back into his past and adding the, CIA N-words scattered throughout his history and sort of blaming them for things that happened to him. CoreAtmaCred asks, was there anything interesting you learned about programming while researching, or did you keep most of your study material for this subject to Terry? So actually, one of my Discord moderators, B, she helped me out a lot in understanding sort of how TempleOS worked. It was really funny, because the more she looked into it, the more she was like, wow, this is really interesting. Wow, this is really lazy. And the more she looked into it, it's like it was a maddening experience for her, because I don't have a whole lot of experience with computer programming. I know like a tiny bit of each HTML and CSS, and that's it. And so to get a computer programmer's perspective was helpful, even if I didn't use it directly in the video. I actually want to interview her in the near future and put that up on the other channel so people can get an idea of what TempleOS was really like on the coding side, because she spent a good amount of time digging into it, and I'm endlessly thankful to be for that. Robert J Magyar asks, how did you go about doing the research for this episode? I'm specifically interested in knowing how you handled the massive amount of content. Brute force. Lots of time. I just watched tons of videos, read tons of forum posts, read anything that I could find about Terry. A lot of it came from finding a post talking about Terry and saying, oh yeah, I've seen their posts from this site. And I'd be like, wait, he posted to that site? And then I'd go hunting off there and they'd say, oh, I remember reading his posts on this other site. And so I just follow this rabbit trail, until I finally found, where he started online. And that was really interesting, just reading through all of these posts. But time, brute force and time. That's how. Shauna Lee asks, so about how much of Terry Davis's streams did you watch while making this, and what were the biggest highs and lows of that experience? So, Terry was very repetitious. I learned that early on, especially during his streams. He would say the same thing over and over again for weeks. So what I started doing was just skimming through these massive streams, and he'd usually be repeating himself over and over, but occasionally, while I was skipping through, there would be this nugget. And those were the highs of that experience, of just finding these amazing little moments. And I shared a lot of them in the video, especially when he was talking about his bird looking at his screen and not understanding what was going on and how his bird would just do the best he could. The lows were just finding nothing. It was really grueling, and there were times where I was like, it's not going to be worth it to do all of this. Just fucking skip over this, Fred. And I decided against it, and I think deciding against that was the best decision I made for the video, because those moments of just letting Terry speak for himself were the most powerful. Tengoon asks, you seem to expect some problems with YouTube demonetizing the video before you uploaded it. Are there any videos you really want to make that you're sure would get you a strike? Not really. I think I could cover most things and be okay. YouTube has specifically come out multiple times and said that they favor documentaries when they're looking at striking videos. What I'm more worried about is getting, flag brigades. So there are certain personalities I probably wouldn't want to cover because their communities would flag me. There was an interesting incident recently where Big Joel got called out when he talked about Anita. Yeah, Anita Sarkeesian is actually someone I would not want to cover because I'd get mass flagged. But he covered Anita Sarkeesian, and then Sargon of Akkad, I think it was. He made a video attacking Big Joel, and then Sargon's video, it looks like what happened was Sargon's viewers went and mass flagged Big Joel's video. That's the kind of incident I'm more worried about. Fortunately, I've had the good sense to avoid those sorts of topics, and I don't think I have anyone that's gunning for me just yet. Abraham F. Timler asks, what's your impression of the fan interviews as a whole, as far as how many there were and how they were approached? Most of these people seemed to be pretty respectful to him, and whenever Terry was interacting with a person one-on-one, he seemed to be pretty lucid. As far as I can tell, the interviews were decently respectful. I don't really have a problem with the way that they were doing it, and most of them at least seemed earnest. Dante Medina asks, what motivated you to reach out to a composer for this episode? Actually, Ryan reached out to me. Ryan is a fantastic composer, and he just approached me saying he wanted to make music. He's been making music for the Down the Rabbit Hole videos since the Furries episode, actually. He only did a few songs for that one, but he's been making all of my music since that point. And he's done a fantastic job, and he really put his back into it for this one. So, thank you, Ryan, if you're listening to this. Dreams Epilogue asks, I only want to know if you know that people from Nevada get slightly upset when people pronounce it Nevada. People from Nevada often pronounce it Nevada. Okay. Didn't know that. Thank you for letting me know. Similarly, everyone, it's not Oregon, it's Oregon. Just Oregon. Argaxon asks, this topic had highly technical parts. Did you need any help understanding any of it? Fortunately, I didn't need it. I got help with it from B, just so that I had an inkling of what was going on with it. But I was more covering Terry's interaction with the internet than I was TempleOS itself. I know that sounds kind of antithetical to, the title of the video, but that's what people were more interested in, was Terry himself rather than TempleOS. TempleOS as a phenomenon was more interesting to me than how it was coded, though I'm certain to a computer programmer the ins and outs of how it works might be more interesting. Rasmus Dane asks, which of Terry/God's hymns was your favorite? I couldn't listen to all of them. That really piercing high-pitched tone gives me headaches and hurts my ears really bad, so I could only listen to so much of it at a time. Torrenkin Livin asks, given that someone like Terry produces so much video content, how much do you watch before feeling satisfied with your research, and how do you know what to watch when so much of it is so inane? The answer is I don't know. I go into it, and a lot of it is gut feeling. I got an English degree, and so being able to pick out the parts that are really important is kind of what I was trained to do. There's no good formula for it. It's mostly just approaching it and being like, okay, does this somehow look different? Is this like a turning point, or does this have similar markers to the rest of it? So for example, during his live streams, he would not talk for significant periods of time, or he'd just repeat himself over and over again for a whole episode. And once I caught on to that, I was able to sort of identify which videos to skip over or skim more, and which videos to zero in on. On top of that, Terry would tend to front load a lot of his content. If he wanted to say something really bad, but he was going to do a 12-hour stream, he would start the stream by saying what he really wanted to say, and then most of the rest of the stream would be pretty quiet or repetitive. Adam D. Goff asks whether or not the parents and family of Terry knew about his internet popularity, or what their thoughts were on his operating system. It's unlikely that they realized to what extent he was so popular on the internet. I know that after he died, there was the temple. There's a little bit, there was some hubbub surrounding the temple. This person that pretended to be Terry A. Davis and got into a group with Terry's family. But it seems unlikely that his family really understood to what extent Terry was so interested, or people had interest in him, I should say. Lydia Collinson asks, do you know whether Terry ever received any counseling or help for his mental illness? So like I mentioned, he was on medication and he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and he was on Social Security. But it's doubtful that he really received the help that he needed, especially after his condition started to worsen. He mentioned early on when he was on the internet that he was visiting counselors and how much he disliked his counselor and thought that they ran on a conspiracy, but it seems unlikely that he continued visiting counselors after some uncertain point in time. So it was unlikely that he was really getting the help that he needed. And that covers it. This was really long, and if you made it all the way to the end, I applaud you. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. I do hope that I could shed a little bit more light on this incredibly complicated topic. Thank you very much, everyone, again.